Good afternoon, it's Joyful Christian Hermit, and I decided on this book, of course it's the right thing to do, but sometimes, we don't want to have to read the introduction or the prologues or even the prefaces. But I decided that I was going to read the introduction because I really don't know that much about the Dark Ages regarding women and the Catholic Church. And so I thought it was doing them justice. I think there's about 17 or 18 women that will be covered. And I'm struggling, with reading with my pain and arachnoiditis. So I thought, don't shrink back like that verse, the end of, I think it's chapter 10, verse 31 of Hebrews. Not to shrink back. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but are those who persevere and go forward and have faith. And I thought, even with my reading, little handicap that is, or disability that has evolved, go for it. And it took me quite a bit of time. And I was asking God, do you want me to spend this time reading this introduction or do something else? And I got this response. And it isn't like this is the Lord speaking, this is what you are to do or anything. It just came to mind. It was just there. This answer. Stop being so concerned about the time. Remember, you have eternity. Take whatever time is needed. Relax. Live. Don't worry about it. And that was a big relief. I tend to be doing this a lot, especially the older I get, and after that illness, the recognition that, I haven't really done what I should have been, could have been, ought have been doing, all these things, that I think of with one of the more hamsters going and the hamster of remorse running on his little wheel in my brain. And this hamster that's rush, 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 be efficient with the time. It's running out. No, the Lord reminded me. Don't do that. Just take it easy. Take it as it comes. And it's not a rush, not a race. And enjoy what I'm going to read and grasp and hopefully share with you all. And if I don't get other things done, if I don't get some manual labor task or whatever, stop worrying about all that. That can become such a burden and can block our lives for God. Get in the way of what God wills of us, which is us to love Him and to love all that He's created. And it's not that we just let our tasks go to the wind or our home maintenance or whatever, but bit by bit by bit. God will provide. The time will be there. The effort will be there, or the resources, or the someone else to do it later or to help. And it's not like I have to have it all done by this weekend. What difference? But not to get flippant either, but this was a message from God of just take it as it comes. Take it as it comes. And there's still plenty of hours left in the day to do, to get the I think I have 2 bushes pruned down to get those cut up and in the trash and all the trash out tonight. I can get that done. I can do some other tasks, clear the counter a little bit more, whatever. So Here's this. This is the introduction to the sainted women of the Dark Ages. And I also then did a little research on these Merovingian time period and the area, the Frankish area, the Franks, the West Germany, France, some of Austria, Western area. That's the area we're talking about for this Dark Ages, which goes from about 550 up to 750, or even 600 to 750 AD is the time period that we're talking about, is these Dark Ages. And part of the land was originally called Roman Gaul, Gaul, which is most of France. It's just a scam, turning it upside down. My phone thankfully clears all these calls, scam calls. So I found it very helpful to read this introduction and to get an understanding of the time period in which these women lived, and also the aspect of Christianity then and the church then. So, and their attitudes toward the saints. So in this book, there's going to be 18 biographies. They lived in the 6th and 7th centuries, so meaning the 700s and the early 800s, or otherwise called the Dark Ages. And Catholic Christianity defined their sense of identity. Their bishops struggled to maintain the remnants of civil authority against pagan Huns and Franks, as well as other Germanic kings who had been converted by Arians. That was a heresy in Christianity by a man named Arius, who claimed that Jesus he did not come from God, from heaven, that he was a man born who was very gifted and very holy, but not the Son of God. And that had been refuted then, that Jesus is the Son of God and came from heaven, not born of nature, of earth, but was of grace from heaven, as I talked about in the video yesterday. So Charlemagne was really one of the last noble ancestors of this whole region. And he was a champion. He fought against the pagans to the north, the Vikings, and would be the North and Eastern, what we would call Germany now, and Scandinavian countries, Ireland, Scotland, England, and then the area that we're talking about, Merovingian, because they were the ruling class, were called the Merovingians. And they were holy women. The women really took the holy role, and the men were more the strong, fighting, violent, battling men in that, going out, battling, and taking over lands. See what else I've got here that was interesting on this page. I'm just going to sort of scan through. I read it all. This time I decided I would not take notes. I would just go back through and pick out points that are of interest. So the women tended to be holy. They were holy. That was their role. And they increasingly filed on to a single path embracing the common discipline of the monastic movement. So monasticism had, of course, flourished. Started 3rd, 4th, 5th century, 4th and 5th in particular, not so much the 3rd. Benedict and Anthony, one of the Anthonys and one of the Benedicts, started their monasteries. I think it was the later, there was a Benedict of Nursia, who was a little bit later in what would be called the Dark Ages or early Dark Ages. And he wrote his Rule of Saint Benedict. So that was very popular then for monastic movement. But it was a different sense given in sainthood in this time than what we have now. So I thought this was of interest in understanding the women plus their culture then. So part of the problem with a lot of the lives of saints in that time period is falsehood, false biographies, some even too much based on legends, or even saints that were made up, people that weren't even real, hadn't lived. And back in that time period, they also felt that that the gods, that the role models of the Greek gods and the Norse gods and etc., that they had been baptized into Christianity and became saints. So they would take these fictitious figures and make them into, mentally, consider them as saints, and make them into like real life people that had just been, they were baptized by Christians and then became saints and were real people then who were saints. So like Zeus or somebody they would have come up with a new name for him, a Christianized name, but used him as a saying that he had been baptized and became Christian and stuff. So a lot of these, just in the writings of these and choosing these 18 different women, they had to be very careful, and do a lot of research and clarify who. And they were the two of them were written by people in their time period, and all of them were written way back, centuries ago. And so this book is actually edited in a translation of these early writers from the Dark Ages and afterwards, medieval times. So not as if people now are writing it. They just cleared research to make sure, and so did the writers back then. They didn't, the two that were from the time period of the saints in that time, in the Dark Ages, knew the people, knew of them, knew they were real. So they had standards developed in order to qualify as a saint then, finally, as a real saint, that they had to have a tomb, a body, had to acquired some material possessions in their lifetime, been married usually, or not always, but mostly. Most of the women saints then were married and had children. So just different culture, different time period. Say the late Middle Ages, where they would forego marriage, not have children, and go off to the convent and consider themselves brides of Christ. So that, I thought that was interesting. Here's something that this Hippolyte Delahaye, more recent hagiographer, says. He broke through the overwrought techniques of literary criticism to secure the historical claims of many saints through coordinating their lives with their feasts and cult centers. The lives before us were intended for public reading, the lives that we'll read, on the anniversary of the saint's death or of the translation or movement of her relics, digging up the body and then transporting, putting the relics in, let's say, a church, tomb in a church, or on display, or even sending them to different body parts, different bones, teeth and all, anything remaining, to various churches that wanted them around the world even. So, but in those times, it would have been in the area of the Frankish territory, the West German, what's now West Germany, France, Belgium, part of Austria, Western Austria, those areas. Let's see. So, or they would use them in the dedication of a basilica, and also for healings, and often would have miracles involving the relics of these women, these saints. And those would also be signals that they were actual. You had an actual body, you had actual relics, and a history, a life history that was validated by people who were alive at the time, and a location where they lived and grew up, and all of those things to validate. Excuse me, I got something in this eye. This is my problem eye. It's not my problem. I'm not going to give it a negative connotation. Out-psych myself here a little bit and say it's just fine. So each woman left a legacy. Of course, there were men in those time periods, lots of men, saints too. They lived a life in historical time. They each one left a legacy of a property, tomb, or own body, or miracle-working relic, which in many cases is still preserved. Their worshippers had a serious interest in remembering who they were and what their credentials were. And their hagiographers, those are the ones that studied these saints and wrote about them. Hagiography is the study of saints. They recorded real estate transactions, promoted their cults of monastic foundations, and attracted new donors to their communities. So more back in their time period, but the ones who wrote about them, or afterwards, but still would encourage, you'd call it a cultist, but this is not in a negative term. It's a group of people who are interested in that person and appreciate that person, and keep up with that person. I mean, like if we, especially like Padre Pio, we could be technically considered occultists of him, followers of him, or promoters of him. That's a good word, so that we don't get confused. We follow Christ, but we might befriend or especially be fond of Padre Pio or Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, etc. So most of these biographies were written by contemporaries, and another name for that time period was the Carolingians. They even have a very distinctive print called Carolingian print from this time period. And in calligraphy, when I studied that and practiced that, I especially like the Carolingian print style. So anyway, we really sort of cut short that time period in history. The church even has. There's not that much emphasized by it. And in this book, they particularly only focus on up to the 9th century, to the 800s. So they even cut the Dark Ages a little short in that. But I think it's good to recognize these human beings and to learn from them, just as we would the saints of today. That, there's a young boy, he was a teenager who put Eucharistic miracles onto internet, and he had died of cancer at about 18 or 17 years old or something, and they made him a saint very quickly. And I think to promote the use of internet or to be contemporary or something. But as I've mentioned before, I think we need to slow down and take time and, just not rush canonizations. There had been a standard set of so many years. You'd wait 5 years before a cause could even be started. And then many years of studying the person's life or waiting and interviewing everyone. But a couple of them have been just within 5 years of their death, they're canonized. And so anyway, that's a different topic. But the saints that we'll have here will know. That's why they put so much emphasis even in their time period to make sure it wasn't one of these legends who had been created as a legend into a saint through word of mouth, or made up that they were baptized by some great Christian holy person, when in fact they were a god or a goddess. So I think it's good to be careful and study these lives. So a hagiographer had first to prove that the subject was a saint. They didn't want emulation of martyrs, or at least a demonstrating. They wanted the person to demonstrate that they were willing to be a martyr if necessary. That was a big criterion then for a martyr. Some of the martyrs weren't killed as martyrs, but they faced threats of violence, and others back in this time period that were considered were very ill, suffered a great deal with sicknesses. That was their martyrdom, and that was allowed. That was considered a type of martyrdom. Some even had genuine physical torment with illness. Or this one, who is it? Radegund even caused her own self harm, which of course we wouldn't consider that good in our time period, to impose sufferings on ourselves to the degree of injuring ourselves or of starving ourselves. It was Athanasius' life of Anthony. Martyrdom was extended to the self-imposed suffering of asceticism. That was prior to Radegund, this idea of causing ourselves to suffer through asceticism, through extreme asceticism, barely eating or not eating at all, or not wearing adequate clothing in cold weather or all types of weather, rain and ice and sleet, and or such as those who lived out in the woods and lived up in the trees, as we talked about those in one of the videos. The dendrites, the ones that lived up in the trees. So there was this, the Merovingian Gaul inherited its hagiographic tradition from Sulpicius Severus, the 4th century biographer of Martin of Tours. whose self-mortification, this is St. Martin of Tours, his self-mortification was coupled with the threats and hardships of missionary life in a pagan countryside. In all our other cases here, God or destiny made happier uses of his consecrated servants. The saint depended heavily on her virtue, female and men, God's miraculous power channeled through the saint, and to prove that he or she was indeed his instrument. So all of these saints would, and in the Dark Ages, a sign of their being saints was that they had miracles attributed to them, and that they gave alms. The women saints in those times tended to have money from their husbands. Their husbands were warriors, soldiers, but would go out and amass wealth by battling other people to get their land. They'd come back, and their women, their wives, the queens, and etc., the noble women, would be given the money by the husbands. The husbands were interested in battling. That was their thing. The women took the role of being the holy ones and of taking the money and distributing it to the poor. So just a different setup than what we have now. And if the women would work miracles, God through the women, there would be miracles, either in life or especially after death, even with their relics or their body. So that's how they would know, oh, this is a saint, this is a saint. And that's how their society, also the help to the poor, was through the women, through the wives of these warrior men, these soldiers who would go out. And they were noblemen too. They were, leaders, not just mercenaries, not just soldiers hired to fight, but it was like the thing of what men did, what noblemen did, went out and conquered to get more land and more wealth. They would plunder also and bring back all this so that their women, then, their holy women, would distribute it, give alms. And then it would also then later on extend it into helping the sick too. So, let's see, through like Clotilde is one. The queen converted her husband and his Frankish followers to Catholic Christianity by promising that her God, see, the wife got converted first, very close to God, holy, and would promise her husband and his men that God would deliver victory on the battlefield for them, for the men. And then that's how the wife, then there would be a victory. She would pray and pray. There would be a victory. It could even seem miraculous victory. Lots of loot to bring back, lots of monetary value. And the husband and soldiers then would start converting because they would believe too. And in many cases it would be God helping, God's miracles. So within a generation of this type of, having the warlike prowess of, say, Clovis with the wife, I guess Clovis is the wife, but with her supportive prayers and gifts to the church, within a generation of this system of the men battling and the women distributing the goods and then helping the sick and then converting people to Christianity by their prayers being the means of victory. So within a generation, the Frankish Christians adopted the Gallic saints as patrons. The saints from Gaul, from more in France, where after the crucifixion and after a few years, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus sailed from Jerusalem and from Bethany over to the south of France in the area of Marseille and Gaul at the time. And Martha and Lazarus settled in a small village there, small town. And Mary went up into the caves in Gaul, the caves of St. Balm, and became a hermit there. So they brought with them, though, all of Christianity to the south of France that way, helped with that, and the saints that were already developing and grew then in the next 600-700 years. Saints developed from the south of France and then also up in the area around Germany and United Kingdom, St. Patrick in Ireland, etc. So the Frankish people, then adopted the Christian saints. 600 years of them. And they were happy to sort of be out from under Rome. Rome was further south. The Roman Empire had been split up when Constantine died. I think his heirs battled and split up the kingdom, the empire. My history isn't that sharp right now, but anyway. So they valued the precious stones and bodies enclosed in gold and things that were the holy martyrs who the Romans had maybe had tried to burn, but they would get bits and pieces of their bodies, the bones or ashes, and encase them in gold and reliquaries and things. So they appreciated having those. But at that time period, they tended to be ambivalent to miracles. I mean, miracles were impressive, but it had to be authentic. They had a lot of fear, that equally fearful or guarded about miracles, that they were from diabolic powers. And Martin of Tours and his successor, Bishop Gregory, prided themselves on exposing false miracles and failed pretenders to sainthood. So that was a big thing in that time period. And that was also another mark of a saint or a holy person, was if they could see who was false of people pretending to be saints or wanting to be, that the ones that could actually expose them, that was a quality of sainthood to the people then. Because they had a gift. Well, and indeed they did. They could sense. They knew they had a gift of inner sight, of seeing something not right in someone and exposing it. So Genovetha, one of the saints we'll talk about, she enjoyed powers of discernment that often enabled her to uncover falsehood and hypocrisy. But despite the opposition of some of the writers of that day, miracles still in Gaul, south of the Frankish territory, really still won the day. They were still very powerful witness, miracles were. And they still are, But they were very careful in their time period, which I think we haven't been so much. That's why we have the rise of New Age, which, as L.S. pointed out from her insights and experiences with New Age, and I agree that not all of New Age is false, but all of it's tainted by the method and the lack of being on the narrow path of Christianity and the misuse of their gifts. Not it's a misuse of spiritual gifts to charge for them. It's a misuse to read souls, and of course, and a big signal is when it's not all accurate. And what's the point? We're not to do that. We're not to be fortune tellers. The spiritual gifts that God gives are to be used for specific occasions that God wants. Like a warning, like with David, to find out the reality of Saul. But for Saul to go and to try to, for malicious purposes, see, that's a misuse. He went to a fortune teller, a seer of his time period, to try to manipulate or to figure out how he could get rid of David. So malicious intent. And of course, the seers weren't of God. And some things were correct and some things not. So they were an early example of a New Age reader, channeler. So the hagiographer's mission was to ensure that a saint employed clean power against dirty power. And the test of a miracle was its conformity to Christian teachings. Sulpicius, he's there's an order of Saint Sulpicius, and he was an early saint, presented Martin of Tours as Jesus's imitator, and insisted that his miracles did not stem from human magic, but originated with God. So it's sort of like that with New Age. It's sort of like magic compared to God's actual miraculous interventions and gifts, spiritual gifts, in some situations. And then in others, the person may be very well-intentioned, may be a Christian, but off track, and mixing the two together and misusing his or her spiritual gifts, which then, in my viewpoint, is a no-go. I'm not as lenient as LS was on New Age, but I had my very strict warning from God. So I think in this Dark Ages time period, they were very careful and discerning more so than we are now in general, out in the world at large. Miracles were certified by literary process of scriptural stylization, heavily underscoring their orthodox character with biblical citations. Merovingian hagiographers were sensitive to folkloric miracles, and their influence weakened as the genre became more firmly articulated. Thus, Genoveffa was credited with more purely magical feats, like her dragon-slaying adventure, than later hagiographers would allow. Even so, her biographer modeled her on Martin of Tours wherever he would allow, or wherever he could. So we'll notice that when I read the story, not the story, but the biography of Genoveffa, that there will be a couple of legendary miracles in there of the slaying of dragons, and of her magic making. She even would call it that. But there are other aspects in her that weren't, and she wasn't intentionally. It was still a carryover of the time period, of the century prior, of the confusion of including these legendary legends that weren't real people as saints. So all of this in history is fascinating in a way as to how saints developed, and in part then why some saints have fallen by the wayside, like Valentine isn't as celebrated. If they had too much legend to them, not enough accuracy that they were a real person, not enough proof, the church has been more careful, which is a good thing. We wouldn't want to be setting our ideals or using as examples in our Christian walk of a not real person, of a made up holy person in effect, or a person with magical traits. It wouldn't be authentic. At least I wouldn't like that. It's nice in fiction, and that's a lot of folklore. Paul Bunyan, or even the story of George Washington, the first president in the United States, and his honesty of admitting he cut down the cherry tree, Well, maybe it happened, maybe not, but we like his honesty. But it's that kind of thing. If the whole person is fake, better for us to have real people to emulate. See what else might be in here that's of interest. So Martin of Tours really became a standard for them for their new Gallic consciousness. And his successor, Bishop Gregory of Tours, wove an account of Martin's latest miracles into his concept of Frankish history as a divine plan. He linked Martin's prestige with the labors of new saints like Monagund, this female Monagund. Bishop Fortunatus also connected his heroine Radegund to Martin and to the saints of the East, who sent their relics to help Radegund in her Christianization of Frankland, of the Frankish territory. The homely medical skills of wise women like Monagund or Radegund, based on cleaning, anointing, and herbal remedies, were extended to divine cures beyond the power of earthly medicine. At its peak, healing power mobilized by the sign of the cross protected Rusticula and attested to her innocence of the charges brought by a murderous king and his jealous minions. The protests of demons as they were driven from the holy places they longed to infest, and from the bodies they had seized from unwary Christians, testified to a power that could effectively be deployed to protect holy things and property from the depredations of secular lords. So people started to notice and to take heed of sacramentals and of persons and of, like, the sign of the cross, prayers, different things, different actions, and it had to be based on Scripture, something in Scripture related to what they did, but that they were a powerful means of driving out evil, or of healing, or of a very wonderful, practical, even to cast out demons of some of the wicked landowners and lords. So throughout the 6th century, saints stood between the conquered people and their rulers, mitigating the effects of their ongoing fratricidal wars. Radegund extended Genovefa's role as an advocate for prisoners and for humble people. Repeatedly, she begged God to help the sick and begged the king to help the needy, establishing a ritual whereby women could express the merciful side of royalty without softening the fierce warrior image of the king. This became a traditional role for Merovingian queens. Even Queen Fredegund, whose ruthlessness was far more widely celebrated than her tender heart, persuaded her husband to burn the old Roman tax records, claiming that God sent a plague that threatened her children in revenge for their oppression of the poor. The 7th century Queen Bathilde took Radegund as her model and cultivated her spiritual power after she left her throne for a monastery. These holy women and the models they presented through their lives thus played a vital role in the final amalgamation of Franks and Gauls into a working community, so that the northern territory and the southern part of France then became more unified as a community, working together and in their Christianity also. But notice how up until that time, with women, it was the nobility and even the queens who really were in the role of the religious women, the religious life, and of the saints, more so than the men. And they did not go off to monasteries so much. Later, by the 700s, they would tend to do that then. Some of the women would, but prior to that, they remained like religious women, without a religious order, but acted in that role as a religious sister. Married children, but they started helping the poor. This one saint after another would move into another area of holiness beyond healing of people, of say the soldiers or different things, or into helping the sick in general and feeding the poor in general, rather than specific need cases for miracles. And then into helping prisoners and orphans. He'd get into orphans. And one of them even had, on a top floor of their castle, or whatever it would be called, had 5 demoniacs, what they called demoniacs then, people with mental illness, and took care of them in their own home up on the top floor. So I found that interesting. I never stopped to think of the evolution of the religious life, and also for women. This is specifically, mostly speaking of women. And in the culture where the men were the warriors more, and out fighting, taking over territories and bringing in the loot, the plunder. So the hagiographers began to circumscribe the powers attributed to the heroines. And even when there was no evidence of fraud, the church was wary of people who bypassed clerical intermediacy and tapped directly into divine power. So with the 7th century rapprochement between church authorities and secular monarchs, the power of female saints while they lived on earth diminished. Few of the 7th century heroines performed miraculous cures until after they were safely dead and buried under the auspices of the local bishop. So because of this concern in the 6th and 7th century that arose, and of the women having this being close to God and having spiritual gifts. The closer we become to God, He blesses us with spiritual gifts often enough. And back then too, some people were born as mystics. God chose that for them, to be born that way. So they had more of a proclivity to the spiritual life, to Christianity, and to all matters of God. But the clergy started to realize, and if that person weren't under the clergy and weren't say, a spiritual daughter or approved of, or if the clergy didn't resent their gifts or their abilities with miracles, the women learned to not, to lay low. But the miracles happened after they died, as they would have on earth had they done the miracles that God would have allowed if it had been safe for them to do so. But it wasn't safe. The clergy didn't like it. They wanted to be in charge because of this fear of false mystics, false saints, false miracle workers, and magic workers, witches, or they didn't call them witches then, but those dealing in magic who were false and not truly holy of God. So we can understand that concern. And that's a valid concern, but then there's also that human element with some of them, of the clergy wanting to have the oversight and the position of authority. See, so that was starting to grow in this time period also into a more viable position and power hold, which came to a peak in Germany right before the Reformation, with all the abuses, clergy abuses of bishops, going out and getting land and taking it from the noblemen, and material wealth and all. They'd become very materialized and did, illicit things with the parishioners. Basically, treated their parishioners as servants, and they were kings over them practically, in essence. So, and the Reformation happened. It had to be broken up. God allowed it. God allowed the church to split then, to be broken, because what came to a head in Germany. That would be 700 years later, 700 to 800 years later from this time period. But it had a little start here in some instances. Other instances, it was because of safety reasons. That's why I had to be checked out. And they proceed with caution if it's somebody that has different gifts than what they're used to. And then the human comes out too with it, though. And that's why often people, mystics, God puts them in exile. God keeps them to himself more then, for their own good, their own protection. And the smart ones take heed earlier on than other ones that get into all kinds of trouble and uproar and have injuries as a result even. So, let's see. There is this comment here that's made, it's probably going on too long. The Germanic aristocracy sought to recover a charisma nullified by their conversion by cultivating Christian sainthood. And I don't know about that, but anyway, to their unquestioned secular power, they added spiritual power by taking control of ecclesiastical offices. The chapels and tombs of sainted relatives were transformed into focal points for family prestige. Women were particularly well suited to this role because they shared the noble blood of their families but could not actively enter into the violent competition of the secular world. They could, however, secure their dowries and inheritances from grasping monarchs by transferring them to God, as did the saints of the Dagobert period. In the monastic life, they could use family wealth to create prestige on earth and favor in heaven. Like Richtrude, Saddleberga, and Gertrude of Neville, they could preserve that same wealth through a line of related abbesses. So that's why the families in this time period, some of them, the noble ones, would put their wealth into their developing their own monastery. And often the wife would be the mother superior or the abbess of it, and if she wanted to be monastic. But it was the women who were the holy ones, the spiritual ones, and that was really the only place women had in society, and they were safe with it because then they could transfer the family wealth into a position that others couldn't get, like other conquerors. It would all be in a monastery, or they would build this monastery, so it wasn't just jewels and gold sitting in somebody's castle, or whatever they called their homes then, estates, coming and plundering. It was a monastery, and that also brought great prestige. And so, poverty, one of the three traditional monastic virtues, was no recommendation for a Merovingian saint. Our texts trace the patterns of womanly power in an age where caste often transcended gender in the division of social and political authority. So the outstanding virtue associated with sainted women in the 6th and 7th centuries was charity, viewed as an adjunct of noble lineage. Let's see what else we have. The first barbarian kings were habituated to an economy of loot and gifts. They displayed their might and prestige by sharing the treasures garnered from their incessant warfare with their warrior companions and with their women. In turn, noble women acted as gift givers to the poor, complementing the traditional role of men as gift givers to their peers. Radegund obsessively moved the wealth her husband had won from his enemies, among whom were her own people, because he married outside of his little area, to the poor, who gathered at her door during his nightly banquets. Monegund and Eustadiola lived more closely in the midst of the people they served, giving their husbands' wealth to the poor and to the church, which hagiographers consistently classed with the poor as joint recipients of the saint's largesse. So, as the Frankish ruling class was gradually Christianized, nobles took their places in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, creating the new religion's infrastructure with their money, influence, and administrative abilities. So, see, this is how this began. It even got to the point later on, and centuries later, but also during this time, that instead of bishops being like ordained or chosen by God, or it would be passed on to family members. The wealthy or the most conquering nobleman would appoint his brother or something to be bishop. And they kept the money in the family then. The wife then would give the money to the church. A brother would be the bishop, or an uncle. Family members would go to the monastery. The women would go there. The wife often would leave the children. The nannies would take care of them. And then also here later, I won't go into this into detail, but it's just fascinating. There came the time when children were then given to the monasteries, some as infants. Well, see that in early times in Judaism, children were, Samuel was given to Eli when he was weaned, maybe 2 or 3 years old, taken and given. to Eli to raise, because Hannah had made that promise. If you give me a child, if you give me a son, then I will give this child to you, Lord. And she took it literally and figuratively and gave him to the church, the temple. And he was reared there, and fortunately was a mystic and a prophet, and it all worked out. So anyway, it all, we see the structure in how things are, how the church is today. So this is good to know reality, I think, and just how it all came about, how it evolved, and in different time periods. Here's one. We see which, well, doesn't matter which woman's saint, but they had another model of sanctity. The monastic lady, withdrawn from worldly power and worldly comfort, but not from the world's misery and strife. She was praised as a model of hospitality, a virtue antithetical to the original desert ideal. That's one of the holy ideals for hermits, is hospitality. Someone comes, someone calls, and in our time period, someone emails or someone texts. I must be hospitable and respond. And I had to be reminded of that the other day when I was grumpy at night and had a text that was, irritated my grumpy little self. And God let me know. Charity, love. This person wants love and a spiritual friend. So I changed my tune, and it's been wonderful ever since. It's amazing how changing myself and my attitude brings such blessings. I act more as God wants me to. So they supported chaplains, working people, pilgrims, invalids, and beggars. They helped relatives and other noble travelers, neighborhood magnates, and prelates. Cared for the sick and the poor, either temporally or permanently. That was the 5 demoniacs housed in the upper stories of Anstrud's monastery. It's her monastery that she kept them in. So, anyway, but now, somebody will feel called by God to start a religious order. And really, unless there's something new and different, a new apostolate that's not ever been thought of, with all of the religious orders out there now, there's no reason to be starting one ourselves. I don't think. Back then, they didn't have so many. But they started monasteries for other reasons. It was to protect their monies, protect their wealth. It was put into a building, and it served 2 purposes: protected their wealth and their position in their 600s and 700s society. But it also then was a gift to God. So they viewed it that way. They developed, they did need to, the noble women enjoyed an independent footing in their relationships with church hierarchy. But as I said, they developed that relationship of not overstepping the hierarchy, not overstepping the clergy. That was not going to be, the clergy had to have a position, a solid footing, a basis in their society. And it did not go well. Say a woman who was very holy and was having many spiritual gifts, and God would do miracles through that person. If they had clergy that was resentful or envious, or felt like they weren't recognized enough, that's when that woman had to cool it and not do the miracles. But then they happened after her death because she was holy. And that's what happens with like a little Charlene Richard in Louisiana at her grave. Miracles occurred there. They occurred after her death. They occurred prior to her death, 2 weeks prior while she was very ill. But the priest and the sister, who was also a nurse, did not talk about it, so word didn't spread. But they found out afterwards when people would start just in their own minds, ask Charlene for a favor, and then they would call the family. We just had this miracle from your daughter, from your recently deceased daughter. So, but back in that time period, so we cannot suppress God, in other words, in people and what God wants to do. But for their sake, the women learned, if the clergy had a problem with them, to lay low while they were alive and be discreet, be very discreet and modest with their spiritual gifts. There's just, see if anything else. It's probably gone on so long, most people didn't make it past the first 5 minutes of this video. By 600, Pope Gregory I was promoting the rule of Benedict of Nursia, written in the latter half of the 500s, and he was promoting it for women as well as for men. And this would include the noble women who lived as religious but weren't in the monastery, but also if they went to the monastery. Bishops often took nuns out of one community and sent them to a new sisterhood. So that's he would take one sister out of a monastery and have her start another, put her in another one to get it built up. One that was wise and saintly model of religious life. Women with proven records in the communal life became solid links in the networks of women who flocked to the monasteries. So that was by the 600s, and definitely into the 700s. The monasteries for women really increased. And by 7th century, the noblewomen were in an unparalleled position to deploy their resources independently. And they seized upon the monastic life to liberate themselves from the violent secular world, and that they sought their own spiritual self-realization. It would be foolish to become so fascinated by their structural position that we forget their own agenda. The monastic life itself was framed in terms of a better and closer family than the world could provide. So actually the family structure developed in and around the monasteries. Says here that the aristocratic habit of keeping monasteries within the founding family made the community their adopted children. Thus, Anstrut's nuns shared her sorrow for the loss of Baldwin, must have been her son, and Gertrude's daughters rejoiced in the care of her niece. So they, family members would take care of the family members, even if they weren't related but were in that monastery. But the families lived in the monasteries, the children and the mother. While the physical mothers of saints are commonly called genitrices, the word mater was reserved for the role of the abbess within the spiritual family. Similarly, soror, as opposed to the more physical germana, was reserved for sisters in the community. So they were developing the terms. mater, mother, mother superior, soror, sister. The greatest instances of grief, loss, and familial affection are reserved to the monastic daughters, who regularly bemoan their fate as orphans when their founding mother is taken away from them. They took it so seriously, and that became their family unit so much that whoever was the mother superior, if she passed on, it was as if their own mother had, or if the bishop had moved that mother superior to another location to develop that further. It was of great grieving and heartache that they missed her. So the sisters, the abbesses, saintly abbesses, were astonishingly free to invent their own way of life through the application and interpretation of rules written by men. So they had the rule of St. Benedict and other rules of the time period, and interpreted them, though, as they desired. They have here Radigan's correspondence with Abbess Caesarea illuminates a process of sharing experiences through a network of women and men devoted to the monastic experiment. Radigan adopted the rule composed by Caesarius of Arles for his sister's convent. She employed his principle of claustration to protect herself from her husband, but did not hesitate to correspond with her royal relatives or personally attend the visitors who converged upon her convent. So she enclosed herself in her monastery to protect her from her husband, So she still had the wealth. He would give her that, but she didn't have to put up with whatever, his abuse or being obnoxious or whatever he was with her, cheating or something, or some kind of a marital problem they had going. Maybe he had halitosis or something, who knows back then. But she was able to get away from him that way and keep her dignity and keep her nobility, and the money would be channeled, the men gave the money to the women to dispense with, to disperse. So that was interesting. The care and nurturing of these monastic communities clearly provided much joy to both the mothers and their daughters. But life in the convent was not all sunshine and light. Many of them were hustled out of the world as soon as the monastery became an established institution, whether they really were spiritually motivated or not. They were sent to the monastery, young, and as it says, even as little children. So they had a tendency to pursue their own ambitions with little regard for communal peace. So that's how it evolved by the time Teresa of Avila in her the monastery of the Incarnation there in Avila. It was just women doing their thing, enjoying social life. It was just a place of status to be in the convent, but they were living more luxury than most women in their homes were. So, and having guests and visitors all the time because it was prestigious to be close to a sister, a religious sister. So, back then, it was started to become a split situation in the monasteries, in the convent life, because you had these women who were just sent there, forced there, young girls, whether they wanted to or not. So they had no evident vocation for the religious life. Children were brought to the monastery in infancy. Some were raised to be nuns and successfully embraced their vocations, as did Badonivia, who wrote one of the Lives of Radigan. Others completed their education and married, like the niece of Abbess Lubavera, who catered her elaborate wedding party in the Poitiers cloister. Other women were formally imprisoned in convents, forced and put in and not allowed to leave, and probably, mistreated, or it says, they were also treated like slaves. So, but also then in other instances, here it talks about the women in that time period, the holy ones, the saintly ones, connected with the monasteries. The bishops would purchase Christians who had been kidnapped by the Muslims or others and used them as slaves. He would buy them back, and then the women would take them into the monastery and help them. Help them have a fresh start in life and be out of their servitude. They would care for the ransomed women. So let's see. Even if they were of a low stature in the community, they still didn't. Many of them liked to go to the monastery, to the convent, because it was an opportunity for them to improve their social status. And it was a motive that was strictly forbidden in the rules of Donatus and of Waldebert. Those two men had rules also, rules of life, rules for monastic life. So, but they did that. They would go and live as nuns to increase become educated and to develop social status. So, just interesting how it all has unfolded. So I'm looking for anything else here that might. Well, we didn't get into it much here. Of the texts increasingly focused on the rounds of prayer and liturgy. The texts, the biographies of these saints of the Dark Ages. Their lives focused on rounds of prayer and liturgy that characterized these women, these consecrated women. Regular offices of psalm singing and praying in unison dominated the life of the sisterhoods. The rules they lived by outlined the round of chant adapted to the changing seasons and penalized any sister who put personal inconvenience or necessity above the chain of prayer that bound them together. The monastery was the scene of an ongoing battle against the forces of evil. The nuns were military cohorts living on the battle lines. The hagiographic texts themselves serve as training manuals and as inspiration. The presence of the devil as a tempter, as a possessor of the unwary, or even as an earthly enemy is pervasive in this time period, in these biographies of these saints, replacing the old pagan persecutors as the agent of suffering and the reason for demonstrations of heroic faith. So the emphasis of the devil as being the antagonist, of being the adversary, and the ruination of souls and of people's lives, that became more dominant in the 600s and 700s, in the Dark Ages, than it had been before. Before, it was the pagans out to kill the Christians, out to kidnap them, that other example I gave, it wasn't the Muslims that was kidnapped. It was pagans that were kidnapping the Christians and making them slaves. The Muslims came later in history doing that. Not long later, but a little bit later, 100 or 200 years later. So my error earlier. But they were still kidnapped and or murdered, martyred. So that changed then somewhat in the Dark Ages, with having more the concern and worry since they were more safe in the monasteries from being kidnapped from the pagans or killed, it was the concern of the devil getting them, overtaking them, disrupting their souls, and tempting them to do evil or to bring evil upon them. That was a big problem. Throughout the 7th century, there was increased attention to the deathbed as the focal point where sainthood was proved. Prior to that, a little bit, it was during their life. But the big proof then became how they were on their deathbed, how they acted, how they viewed their impending death, if they had any revelations. That was always a sign that they were a saint. If they knew, when they were going to die or could foretell it, that was, they looked to these things. The people around them looked for signs, these outer signs, that they were saints. And be on the deathbed, how they were on their deathbed was a place where they really would take heed to notice any little thing that seemed holy or miraculous or extremely virtuous, etc. So we'll find out more as we read. We'll see some of these examples. This is probably my longest video. I mean, I get into this stuff, but the Lord said to take my time. Oh my goodness, yes. Well, prize to any of you who made it through this whole hour and nearly 22 minutes of talking about the times of the dark ages for women in particular, and the spiritual life and the culture. God bless His real presence in us. And thank you for these women. And Lord, thank you for more insights on how the Catholic Church evolved, just in its traditions and in its practices, and the temporal aspects of it, even not the spiritual aspects, wonderful, but also the temporal things that it's good to be aware, and then also not to get too caught up in the temporal. That we can see how it's evolved, partly through culture and time periods and people. So